Dare to enter Crow's Quill's books, where tales of forgotten realms and fearless souls come alive. Today's journey, Plato Wyngard and the Valley of the Immortals, Chapters 1 to 3, by Mark and James Lindsay. Will you uncover the truth hidden in the shadows? Chapter 1, 1965. Plato surveyed the carnage before him. Dead bodies, women, children, their limbs splayed in a tangled mess of heartbreak. He swore when he realized that the wet sensation on his left foot was caused by a slowly rising river of blood. He didn't have time to dwell on this, as bullets tore at the ground around him. Just another day at the office, he thought, as he dived for cover. Captain Plato Wyngard was currently serving on operational service in Malaya as part of the 22nd Special Air Service. Standing at 6 feet and a lean 200 pounds, Plato didn't make his rank from being a hulking brute like his predecessor, but rather his quick thinking under fire and his piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare right through an opponent. This ability to be cool under pressure had raised many whispers from his superiors as to the maturity of someone so young. Plato and his section had been in pursuit of rogue militia who were brazenly moving from village to village recruiting numbers for their vile power trip. Those who refused to join were left in a pile much like the one he had just witnessed. Diving for cover, Plato landed into a controlled crouch, his Owen submachine gun returning fire. Unable to see through the smoky haze, he heard the reassuring thump of a body hitting the ground. This was joined by the familiar sound of 7.62 millimeter fire from other members of his unit. Crawling into a nearby ditch, he scanned his immediate surroundings. Hell had literally broken loose. The poor intel they had received about a small rogue militia was woefully inaccurate. This was more like a well-equipped platoon strength squad. Plato saw movement to his front, and 2 militia raced past. Plato instinctively pointed and fired, the trained double-tap method felling both enemy soldiers. "Bulldozer, lay down some fire to the east," Plato yelled out, struggling to be heard over the noise of small arms fire. Almost immediately, the heavy sound of a machine gun answered. Things weren't a total hash. They had moved into the village knowing that there were insurgents. Despite their numbers being larger than expected, Plato's team knew their roles and how to work under pressure. "They're trying to withdraw," a thick Yorkshire accent called out. "You know what to do?" Plato replied. Excellent, he thought. Despite the militia size, they were inexperienced. Trying to withdraw to the east, they were going to expose themselves to his cut-off element, and as if on cue, a series of loud explosions rocked the position, the result of friendly grenades. Movement to Plato's left caused him to spin around, his finger squeezing the trigger, then releasing it suddenly. Lance Corporal Dwight Ferret Tillinger was squinting back at him, his face almost unrecognizable under a thick layer of black camouflage. Both men nodded. Plato gave him the hand signal to pick up and move forward. Ferret nodded back. Using sharp and well-practiced movements, they slowly advanced their way through the village. Covering each other, they leapfrogged past the dead bodies and through the vegetation. By now, other members of his team had joined them. In an extended line, they cleared the village of any and all insurgents. Once he was satisfied that all enemy had been eradicated, Plato signaled Ariorg and all members went about their tasks of forming a protective perimeter, dealing with any casualties, taking stock of ammo and equipment, and finally enemy dead. Plato was in the process of calling in a situation report when 2 of his soldiers, Trooper Harry Houdini Blackwell and Corporal Dean Meerkat Caswell, dragged a bloody but breathing figure into his location. "What have we got, Meerkat?" Plato asked. "It's our only POW, sir. I guess we were too effective." Meerkat said with a wry grin. You won't hear me complain. Is he talking? Plato asked. His English is barely understandable, but he wanted to speak to you, Ferret added. Probably wants to spill his guts in exchange for medical help, Plato said. He then turned his gaze on the wheezing and bloody enemy figure. So what great piece of information do you plan to impart in exchange for first aid and food? Plato said with a withering glare. The POW was deathly pale, and his breathing was now short and rapid. He motioned for Plato to lean forward so he could speak. Plato obliged grudgingly, and the POW whispered something into the young captain's ear, gasped, and lay dead. Plato's eyes narrowed at the information he had just heard. Grasping the dead militia by the collar, he shook him roughly. Who do you work for? Tell me? Plato growled. Sir, he's dead, Meerkat said uneasily. What did he say? Ferret asked. Plato ignored the question as he stared into the distance, his sudden outburst rattling his two subordinates. They were not used to seeing their leader lose control. Chapter 2 1976 Plato sat alert on an upturned whiskey barrel with his back to the wall, sipping snake wine. His thoughts drifted back to his days in Malaya in particular, the words that had been whispered to him by the dying rebel. In the shadow of night, both the wolf and sheepdog look alike. Those words and the events that followed had driven him ever since. It had been 11 years since he lost his team in a hail of bullets and deceit. 11 years, and he was still chasing ghosts. 2 years had seen him licking his wounds at the summit of Mount Karstens in Indonesia, which hadn't been all bad, as he had been able to train in the deadly art of Kali under the tutelage of an old farmer. Plato had spent another 2 years chasing a false lead in Laos that had nearly resulted in his death at the hands of an opium-addicted Dutch arms dealer. The last 7 years, he felt as if he had been chasing his tail, until 2 weeks ago, when a promising lead had driven him to Hanoi. Now sitting opposite Plato was Chi, a local gun for hire which in Hanoi wasn't too special. But what set Chi apart from others was his outright opposition to General Tun, who was now moonlighting as the #1 supplier of heroin to the U.S. Chi's uninhibited reporting of the general's extracurricular activities had made Plato's drinking companion a marked man, something which the ex-SAS trooper admired. Between them was a table fashioned out of the bullet-riddled roof of a U.S. Army Jeep and 4 empty bottles of snake wine. Plato was skeptical at first about the rice wine infused with the milked venom of a cobra, but after the first 2 bottles, its effects had grown on him. Plato had specifically chosen this booth as it gave him full access to the bar, and once he had knocked out the overhead light, he now had the appearance of anonymity as well. Plato had been half listening to an interesting tale of a recent prison break when a rather odd individual entered the bar. The new patron, a painfully thin individual, immediately engaged the barkeep, who shook his head uninterested and went about the half-hearted task of cleaning grimy glasses. The new patron was completely out of place, dressed in an expensive pale gray suit and tie that Plato guessed was handmade silk. It was obvious that the patron was waiting for someone, as he sat at his table without ordering and kept glancing at the entrance door, jumping nervously at every little noise that drifted in from the busy street beyond. Plato's interest was piqued by the intrusion of this other person into his otherwise quiet morning. It was at that moment that the Western-style saloon doors flew open, and in walked a man who shocked Plato to his core. Former Colonel Kwan, or as he was also known, the Stone Viper, now the right-hand man of General Tun. What the hell is he doing here? Plato thought, wishing he wasn't sitting in the company of Chi and glad that he'd removed his overhead light source. The stone viper's presence hadn't gone unnoticed either. Chi's eyes had gone wide and his jaw clenched. He was about to stand up and probably do something extremely stupid when a restraining hand from Plato prevented his movement. Plato indicated with a twitch of his head that two goons were positioned outside the bar, more than likely armed to the teeth. Chi nodded and settled back in his chair, both men now a captive audience, watching the scene intently. The stone viper was a formidable-looking individual. Taller than most Vietnamese, he was also broad in the shoulders. That, and his tailored black suit, made him look like someone you didn't want to cross. He had been given the nickname, the Stone Viper, by his enemies, due to the stony expression that he always wore and the lightning lethality of his actions. This nickname was now a moniker he wore with pride. His reputation was common lore to the locals. This was obvious by the fearful expression on the face of the gray-suited gentleman the viper sat down opposite. Their conversation was in Vietnamese, which was not a problem for Plato as he had been in the country for a few years, but the distance of their table was making it hard to follow the entire conversation. It was obvious that the man in the gray suit, whose name he now knew as Hu Ong, hadn't been expecting the viper, but rather a client who was going to be paying for valuable information. From what Plato could gather, Hu Ong had been working for General Tun, but had disappeared until now. The viper was relishing the other man's unease. Everything that he said was dripping in deadly innuendo. It wasn't until he heard the words, Jade Cup, that Plato sat up sharply in his seat. The famed Jade Cup was the focus of an infamous legend in Southeast Asia, a mystical object with the ability to impart the gift of eternal life, as well as cure any illness. Plato had been listening intently when a crashing sound erupted from the bar. The barkeep looked around both sheepishly and annoyed as he had dropped a tray of glasses. Plato's tension eased slightly as he turned back to the viper and his prey. Only now it was just the lone, slumped figure of Hu Ong and the noisy slapping of the saloon doors. Plato leapt to his feet and bolted to the exit. The contrast of the bright sun outside and the seedy din in the bar was like a slap in the face. That, and the overwhelming noise in the street from vendors and scooters. It took Plato a moment to orientate himself, and by the time he did, the viper was long gone. Chapter 3. Former Gunnery Sergeant Luther Macbeth had been filling in forms at the glorified card table he called an office for the past 3 hours. A strapping African-American, Luther was an intimidating individual. Standing at 6'5" and 270 pounds of angry muscle, Luther had always been a man of action, and whether it was running with his old gang, the Black Pharaohs, back in Detroit, or serving as part of the elite Marine Recon Unit here in Vietnam from 68 to 73. He hated inactivity. Now, sitting in front of a desk loaded with bureaucratic paperwork, he swore that this was one opponent he wouldn't be able to defeat. As he was deciding whether to continue working or set fire to his desk, the phone rang from somewhere underneath. In the process of looking for it, Luther sent whatever order he had managed thus far into the air and floating to the ground. Swearing loudly, he finally picked up the phone just as it stopped ringing. Luther roared, then slumped back into his chair, defeated. He barely moved at the sound of the door opening. "Please tell me you're the new secretary?" "Ha, you wish, although I'm sure I have the legs for it." Luther laughed at his partner's joke. "Ah, Plato, I was wondering when you would emerge to rescue me from this nightmare. You might have the legs, but that British accent is a real turn-off." Luther sighed. "I take it you haven't finished the flight manifests then?" Plato asked dryly. "You're hilarious. You know, when you asked me to join you in this venture, you gave this grand speech about being free, Working our own hours, finding adventure, women, and possibly even making a difference, Luther said. And your point? Plato said, grinning. You never said anything about this god-awful paperwork. Luther sighed. Relax, my overly sensitive friend. How about I take you for a drink and tell you about my rather eventful morning? Plato said, turning serious. As much as I would love the distraction, we can't. We actually have a prospective paying customer due here, any moment, Luther said, consulting his watch. So maybe you should freshen up a little before she arrives. You look like hell, Luther grumbled. Ahem, a softly spoken voice breathed. Both men spun around, and for the first time that day, were pleasantly surprised. Bian Lam stood before the two men, her stance a mixture of feminine grace and steely determination. At only 5 feet, she was used to most people dismissing her immediately as nothing more than a pretty girl, which she was. Bian was in her mid-20s, dressed in cargo shorts and a loose blouse that accentuated a lithe and athletic body. But what made Luther and Plato stare were her beautiful, large, jade-green eyes that complemented her high cheekbones and rose-petal lips. Bian stood with arms crossed defensively. She gauged their all-too-familiar reaction. Yes, I'm the one from the phone earlier. Luther was the first to take the initiative. Stepping past Plato, he placed a guiding hand around the young girl's shoulder. Yes, that was me on the phone. Luther Macbeth, Luther said casually. It's a pleasure to meet you, Bian said dryly. The pleasure's all mine, Luther purred. Plato groaned and rolled his eyes as he followed them towards a set of chairs and a small table in the corner of the office. After the formal introductions were done, Bian was keen to talk business. Bian was all business, despite the heavy flirting from Luther. Plato had to keep moving the subject back, much to Bian's relief. So, to be clear, your only requirement is a delivery of medical supplies to Te Nguyen, nothing more, Plato said. Yes, that is correct, as it was the other 4 times you asked, Bian said, a note of annoyance in her voice. You'll have to forgive me, but it's not often that we get an educated, motivated individual such as yourself in our office with, how do you say? Plato struggled for the right words. Such a bullshit story. You think I'm lying to you? Bian said angrily as she jumped to her feet. You think you're the only cargo plane I can buy? Hey, steady on, Luther said calmly to Bian, then also addressing Plato. My man here didn't mean to offend you, but in our line of work most people have an agenda and their reasons for keeping it secret. Bian was now listening, but the look on her face said that she was prepared to walk if she felt she was going to be insulted again. I'm listening, Bian said. You're asking us to deliver 2 tons of medical supplies, and you're paying up front. Nobody has that kind of money to throw around, Plato said. We're financed by a Canadian-based NGO, and it's taken more than a year to raise, Bian replied. What also concerns me is the location. There's a lot of drug smuggling coming from that region. I don't want to get up in the mountains only to have our plane hijacked and used for heroin smuggling. So I'll ask you this. Why Te Nguyen? Bian frowned and paused before replying. Why specifically Te Nguyen? Because it's my home, Bian said. My father is a chieftain for the Dagar people. Since the war and because of the drug trade thereafter, the health and well-being of my people has been poor. I have spent the past 3 years trying to find anyone who will help, and then raising sufficient funds to get where I am. Yes, there are some drugs in the cargo, but only pharmaceuticals. And the reason I'm paying up front is because I know that the flight can be dangerous. Plato's stance softened. Not that I'm complaining, but why us? Luther asked. Your rep. You may be rough, but you're honest and always get the job done, Bian said. Plato was silent. He looked at Luther and was sure the big man had already made his mind up. We'll do it. But if I find out that any of this story is bogus, we walk and I'll keep the money as out-of-pocket expenses. Do we have an understanding? Plato asked. Bian looked him in the eyes without wavering. Then we have a deal, Bian said. Excellent. We'll iron out the details tomorrow, Luther said, trying to smooth over the unease that was still hanging in the air. Bian didn't waste any more of their time. Shaking hands, she quickly departed. Plato watched her closely as she left. Well, brother, that was close, Luther said, patting Plato on the back. What was close? Plato asked. You nearly blowing that deal, Luther said with a shake of his head. The deal's not done until it's done. Besides, that girl's hiding something and I'm intrigued as to what, Plato said. Well, all I know is that we have a job to look forward to and a chance to pay some bills, Luther said. Plato grumbled under his breath. Hey, I'm pretty sure something was mentioned earlier about getting a drink and telling a story, Luther said, trying to change the subject. This seemed to shake Plato from his thoughts. Yes, of course, Plato replied. Then his eyes narrowed a little at the thought of his morning with Chi. Do I have a tale for you? That seals today's tale in shadows. We hope Plato Wyngard and the Valley of the Immortals has drawn you deeper into its enigma. Return soon to Crow's Quills books, where the next chapter awaits, whispering secrets yet untold.